We are talking about a civilization so advanced, so terrifyingly organized, that modern engineers still stare at their blueprints and weep. Can you believe 4,500 years ago, while the rest of the world was still figuring out how to stack stones, this empire built cities with running water, centralized waste management, and climate control so effective it felt like air conditioning. They had perfected the art of living in the most unforgiving landscape imaginable, a harsh, blazing desert balanced only by the deep, star-choked cool of the night. This was the Indus Valley, the greatest secret history ever buried by the shifting sands of time, a society that achieved utopia only to have it ripped away by forces they never understood.
They didn't just build homes, they engineered thermal fortresses against the very fury of nature. Imagine walls thicker than a modern SUV, constructed of precise, sun-baked brick, perfectly uniform across hundreds of miles of territory, identical in size and proportion from the bustling port of Lothal all the way up to the colossal mounds of Mohenjo-Daro. These weren't mere dwellings. They were architectural masterpieces designed for passive climate regulation. They were thermal batteries, soaking up the lethal solar radiation during the 120-degree day, and then, slowly, agonizingly, releasing that stored heat back into the cool night air, keeping the internal chambers at a perpetual, luxurious balance. It was climate control achieved through sheer monolithic architectural genius, a testament to a scientific knowledge base we still struggle to fully comprehend. And inside these incredible, silent structures lived a people who, strangely, left almost no trace of war. No great statues of conquering kings, no piles of weapons, no fortified citadels screaming defiance. Just the quiet rhythm of commerce, the hum of the potter's wheel, and the precise clatter of trade seals being stamped on packages heading for distant Mesopotamia and the Sumerian kings.
They valued mathematics over massacre, organization over oppression. They were the world's first true urban planners, designing their colossal megacities on a rigid grid system that defied the chaos of the natural world. Every street was standardized. Every bathhouse was built to the same exacting specifications, and their drainage system was so advanced that Rome wouldn't catch up for another 2,000 years. They had mastered life. They had conquered the environment, and they had eliminated conflict, or so they thought. But perfection, history teaches us in the bloodiest chapters, is the most fragile of illusions. And the very desert they had tamed, the great unpredictable river that fed their endless grain fields, was about to betray them in a catastrophe no one saw coming. A slow-motion environmental disaster that makes all modern climate crises look like a brief summer shower. Beneath the surface of this utopian calm, tectonic plates were grinding, the world's weather patterns were fundamentally changing, and the slow, inexorable gears of global climate change were beginning to turn, threatening to drown or desiccate every single achievement they had carved into the subcontinent. Every single evening, as the brutal, baking day finally receded, the citizens of the Indus Valley knew true comfort. They relied absolutely on those 3-foot-thick walls to mediate the wild, life-threatening swing of the desert climate.
The contrast was everything. The furnace outside, giving way to the cool, dark sanctuary within. They ate their evening meals in rooms that were decades ahead of their time, believing their technology was permanent, that their system was foolproof, that their mastery of the environment was absolute, guarded by the very geometry of their homes. But while they slept soundly, protected by their magnificent bricks and their flawless civic engineering, the fate of their entire civilization was being decided hundreds of miles away, high up in the unforgiving Himalayan watershed. The lifeblood of their empire, the mighty Indus River, and its now vanished sister river, the mythical Sarasvati, was not a stable, eternal deity. It was a fickle serpent, twisting and recoiling in response to forces they couldn't even name, shifts in monsoon belts, and the slow uplift of the earth itself. Imagine the terror, the silent dread that must have gripped the priests and governors as the predictable rhythm of their world began to fail. First, the subtle, almost dismissible signs, the wells dipping lower than expected, the annual floods arriving not with their usual life-giving gentleness, but with terrifying, explosive violence, or worse, not arriving at all, leaving the fields cracked and sterile. These were not the sudden, explosive attacks of an enemy army. This was a slow, agonizing strangulation by the very forces that had given them life. Their perfect climate control, their sturdy walls, their utopian urban planning, it would all prove utterly useless against the slow, crushing fury of a dying river system, against a desert that decided it wanted its territory back. We are going to peel back the layers of sand and myth to uncover exactly how the most advanced, most peaceful society of the Bronze Age simply vanished, leaving behind only the ghosts of their perfect walls and the echoing silence of their magnificent, unsolved mystery. Get ready, because this is the story of the Indus Valley collapse, and it is a disaster that should have been impossible. Imagine walking the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, not in some chaotic ancient mud pit, but in a city so ruthlessly organized it would make a modern civil engineer weep with envy. This was not a collection of haphazard tents and shacks. This was a machine designed for mass living and structured efficiency. The citizens of the Indus Valley believed they had conquered chaos itself. Every major thoroughfare ran perfectly north-south or east-west, forming a flawless grid that maximized airflow and sunlight control. Forget organic growth. This was premeditated perfection. It was a societal commitment to order. And their bricks? Oh, their bricks were the silent, standardized testament to their obsession with control. Every single baked brick across an area twice the size of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined adhered to a strict, non-negotiable 4:2:1 ratio. Think about that. Absolute uniformity across thousands of miles, ensuring flawless structural integrity and easy construction in every settlement. They weren't just building structures. They were establishing a manufacturing standard that would not be seen again for millennia, a sign of central authority and astonishing supply chain management.
These massive, thick walls, sometimes reaching 4 feet in depth, were the ultimate defense against the relentless heat of the subcontinent. The internal temperatures of their homes remained cool, balanced by the heavy thermal mass, an ancient form of passive air conditioning. They manipulated their environment, believing themselves masters of the elements. But the true heart of their technological arrogance lay beneath the paving stones. While European kings, centuries later, were still throwing raw sewage out of windows, the Indus people had achieved what we would recognize today as modern plumbing, 4,000 years before anyone else. Every single home in the major cities possessed a private bathing area and a toilet connected to an astonishing, sophisticated underground drainage system. Imagine the sheer audacity of this infrastructure. Covered drains, often constructed of neatly fitted stone and baked clay, ran beneath the streets, carrying waste safely away from the living areas and the public water sources. They understood sanitation and the principles of disease control before there was even a name for germs, a miracle of public health management unrivaled in the ancient world. And then there was the citadel, the high ground, housing the most sacred, powerful structures, like the colossal Great Bath. This wasn't just a pool. This was a massive, watertight tank, lined with natural bitumen to prevent leakage, suggesting ritual purification and a monumental, systemic control over their most precious resource, water. The people of the Indus Valley had solved the fundamental problems of urban life: heat, water management, and waste disposal. They were untouchable, shielded by their own genius from the messy realities of the world around them. They had built a perfect machine. But perfection is the most fragile state in the universe. And when you build a system designed to withstand everything, you fail to prepare for the one thing it can't handle: the betrayal of its foundation. The river, the mighty Indus, was not just a resource. It was the lifeblood, the god, the entire reason their civilization existed. They had tamed the land, constructing perfect levees and standardized fields, but they forgot they hadn't tamed the water itself. For centuries, the Indus was reliable, bringing life-giving silt and ensuring prosperity. And they built their entire magnificent economy, their flawless grid, their meticulous sanitation, on the assumption of its constancy. But the climate was changing, subtly at first, a creeping, insidious doom that didn't arrive with the clamor of war drums, but with the quiet sound of dust on dry earth. The monsoon rains, the critical annual deluge that fed the Indus and its tributaries, began to whisper less intensely, failing to deliver the necessary volume. It wasn't a sudden catastrophic flood they feared. It was something far more grueling: drought creeping in, year after grueling year, weakening the system from the inside out. In the perfect city, where everything was standardized and controlled, people started to notice the water level in the reservoirs dropping further than they ever had before. The vast granaries, designed to hold the surplus of the fertile plains, began to look noticeably less full. This wasn't just an inconvenience.
This was the beginning of the end of the perfect machine, the first cracks appearing in the facade of their invincibility.
We are talking about the vast river network that centered around the Ghaggar-Hakra system, a massive complex often identified by historians as the mythical Saraswati River. Hundreds of settlements, including many of the largest, were completely dependent on this secondary yet massive water source. And this is where the true terror began. Geological data tells a devastating story. Tectonic shifts, slow and relentless, began to subtly change the elevation of the land, capturing tributaries and literally redirecting the water flow away from the centers of civilization and sending it elsewhere. The river didn't just slowly dry up, it ruthlessly abandoned them. Imagine the utter confusion. The water just vanished, not due to human error, but due to an earth tremor miles away, unseen and unstoppable, altering the very topography of the subcontinent. Their perfect, inflexible city planning suddenly became a death trap. A city and an entire society designed for overwhelming abundance is fatally ill-equipped to handle acute scarcity. Their obsession with standardization, which had been their profound strength, became their ultimate weakness. They could not easily shift their massive population centers or fundamentally alter their agricultural practices because everything was locked into the rigid 4-to-1 ratio of the established order.
The mighty cities of the West, like Mohenjo-Daro, began to suffer the ultimate insult: depopulation. Not a sudden massacre, but a slow, agonizing bleed as people were forced to migrate eastward toward the still-flowing Ganges system, seeking land that hadn't been betrayed by geology.
But as the population shifted, the infrastructure crumbled. Who maintained the flawless sewage systems when the community structure fractured? The perfect machine, starved of its energy source and its standardized labor, began to choke on its own complexity. The walls remained thick, the streets remained straight, but the life inside was fading. The silence that researchers find when they excavate these ruins is not the silence of a people who were suddenly wiped out by invaders, as was once believed. No, it is the far more terrifying silence of a highly complex system that simply ran out of power, succumbing to the one force it never planned for: the cold, indifferent cruelty of geological change. The invincible had become the inevitable casualty. The invincible had become the inevitable casualty. But how does an empire built on perfect predictability suddenly fail? It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic strike. It was far more sinister. A slow, creeping poison administered by the very life source they trusted. A betrayal so profound it defied the logic of their engineers. The Indus, their mighty mother, the giver of all wealth and stability, did not explode in a destructive flood or dry up overnight in a shocking display of power. No, the river decided to pack its bags and move. An incomprehensible geological betrayal that played out over generations, unnoticed by the political elite, consumed by the rhythm of the predictable monsoon cycles. They missed the subtle terror
creeping up the banks. Imagine the existential dread in the heart of the eastern settlements. The sprawling cities connected by the legendary Saraswati or Gagar Hakra system. Not as the walls crumble, but as the water level drops just a little further each year. Imperceptibly at first, then dramatically, changing the entire hydraulic equation that sustained millions. Their entire infrastructure, the stunning precision of their public baths, the sophisticated drainage systems, the massive citadels that towered over the plains, depended on a constant, predictable flow and pressure, maintained by the perfect, static geometry of the land. When the massive tectonic shifts began deep beneath the earth, the foundational plates beneath the subcontinent groaned and shifted, subtly tilting the entire landscape. This slow geological dance acted like a giant, invisible hand, gently redirecting the course of the ancient tributaries, the mountain-fed torrents that provided the lifeblood of the breadbasket. The Himalayan runoff, the snowmelt that had sustained them for millennia, was diverted by millimeters of elevation change until the old channels were starved, cut off from their primary source. Where once there was a powerful, reliable river, there was now only a trickle, and eventually just dust, echoing the ghosts of ancient flows. The river didn't disappear, it abandoned them, carving a new path miles away, rendering the vast, fertile plains that fed the millions instantly worthless, transforming the greatest agricultural engine in the world into a sprawling, sun-scorched desert. This wasn't just a drought. It was the environmental equivalent of ripping the central processing unit out of a supercomputer that governed a flawless machine. The meticulously planned granaries, those legendary repositories of grain designed to sustain populations through 1 or 2 bad seasons, now faced an existential, perpetual crisis that no storage capacity could ever overcome. The farmers, the backbone of this flawless society, stood paralyzed, looking upon their cracked fields, the clay transforming almost overnight from life-giving silt into unforgiving, sun-baked, impenetrable armor. The agricultural surplus that fueled their incredible trade and allowed their highly specialized society to flourish vanished almost instantly, taking with it the foundation of their wealth. Trade routes that relied on efficient river transport shuddered to a halt. Coastal ports like Lothal, once bustling hubs of international commerce with Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, found themselves isolated and increasingly irrelevant, as the interior cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro began to choke on the scarcity. The intricate network of standardized weights and measures, the cubic chert weights, the symbol of their unified commercial genius and trust, now measured nothing but scarcity and despair. The perfection of their system became its ultimate weakness. They were a complex machine designed for one environment, and when that environment shifted, the machine seized up entirely. And what about their famous, thick-walled protection, the ultimate defense against the raging summer heat? Those architectural masterpieces designed to insulate and cool the interior spaces now became their thermal prison. These masterful architectural solutions, perfect for stabilizing temperature when the external environment was merely hot and moist, became merciless thermal traps when the desert truly arrived, relentless and dry.
The humidity that the people relied upon. The humidity naturally generated by the sprawling river and massive irrigation tanks was gone, evaporated into the fierce, dry air. The evaporative cooling effect vanished, leaving only the dense, heat-retaining bricks to relentlessly radiate trapped warmth back into the choked, crowded streets and homes.
The meticulously engineered climate control system was suddenly upside down, amplifying the suffering rather than mitigating it. The perfect city was now cooking its inhabitants slowly, sealed off by walls that offered protection from external chaos, but provided no relief from the inescapable internal catastrophe of the dry heat.
Archaeological evidence shows a shocking, dramatic shift in lifestyle within the great cities. As the centralized authority, which relied on the smooth flow of resources, began to fail, the meticulous order dissolved. The perfectly planned streets became cluttered, blocked by hastily constructed substandard homes built upon the main avenues, a desperate, ugly sprawl consuming the beautiful urban design. The advanced drainage, the crown jewel of their civilization, became neglected, choked with waste and debris. The highly organized grid system, once a symbol of enlightenment, fractured into localized chaos as people struggled purely for immediate survival, losing faith in the collective, centralized structure that was failing them so catastrophically.
The perfection, once their savior, became the instrument of their slow annihilation. They were victims of their own success, too specialized, too reliant on a geographical stability that the planet simply decided to withdraw with cold indifference. The great urban centers, once humming with the sound of commerce and advanced craft, now echoed with the dreadful silence of stagnation, punctuated only by the cries of the desperate. The people looked to their priests, their leaders, their engineers, and found only empty promises whispered against the sound of the relentless, dry wind. The sophisticated script they used, still undeciphered by modern man, might have recorded these pleas, these desperate attempts to understand the unexplainable abandonment by the river gods. This was not the end of a civilization by invasion or plague. It was the terrifying, drawn-out realization that their gods had simply abandoned the Indus, leaving the perfect cities to face the cold, indifferent cruelty of the encroaching desert alone. The final, agonizing act of survival, an ugly, desperate scramble against the inevitable, was about to begin. The great bath of Mohenjo-Daro, once a shimmering, crystal-clear centerpiece of civic pride and ritual cleansing, was starting to look sickly. Its immense geometry, engineered to hold the lifeblood of the city, now reflected a deeper, terrifying truth. The supply lines were choking. For generations, the ritual had been simple: purify the body,
purify the soul, trust the river god to refill the tank.
But the river god, or whatever force they believed governed the currents, had seemingly abandoned them. The meticulously maintained drains, those subterranean arteries of urban genius, were running sluggishly, carrying less and less away, because there was less and less to bring in. It was a terrifying inversion. The system designed for limitless flow was now struggling with agonizing scarcity. The perfect engineering was holding steady, but the source of life was vanishing.
The horror was amplified by how slowly it unfolded. This wasn't the sudden, fiery wrath of a volcano, or the immediate terror of an invading horde. This was the long, cold indifference of planetary mechanics playing out over decades. Geologists today understand what the priests and architects of Harappa could only dread. The shifting tectonics of the Himalayas were rearranging the map of the subcontinent. The massive tributary system, the very spine of the civilization, what some scholars believe was the legendary Saraswati River, was beginning its great, final migration. It wasn't a sudden flood. It was far worse. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation as the headwaters of the river, the glacial melt that fed their perfect world, were captured by the mighty Ganges system instead.
The rivers that had sustained millions were literally rerouting their destiny, leaving behind dusty, skeletal channels in the heart of the once fertile plains. The thick-walled homes, designed to buffer the heat, now trapped the desperate anxiety. Families who had relied on the predictable rhythms of the monsoon for millennia watched in horror as the clouds delivered only whispers of rain, meager dust showers instead of the torrential blessings they needed for the kharif crops.
The yields dropped, not by percentages, but by catastrophic fractions. The stored wealth of the granaries, once overflowing with a surplus that guaranteed social peace, began to shrink, revealing the terrifying limits of their technological foresight. They had planned for every contingency of city life, from wastewater management to the standardized size of their homes, but they had failed to plan for the planet, rewriting its own rules.
One of the most remarkable hallmarks of the Indus people was their absolute commitment to standardization. Weights and measures across cities separated by hundreds of miles, from Dholavira in the south to Mehrgarh in the north, were identical, perfect cubes of chert and agate. This wasn't just trade efficiency. It was a societal promise, fairness, order, and absolute trust in the system. But when the granaries started to empty, the perfect chert weights suddenly meant nothing. When every man knows his neighbor's well is shallower than his own, the illusion of societal harmony begins to fracture. The weight of grain became heavier than the weight of tradition. Trust, the invisible mortar holding the perfect city blocks together, began to crumble under the relentless pressure of thirst and hunger. The city administrators, those silent, powerful figures, whose authority was usually absolute, found themselves facing the raw, desperate terror of the population. They were the engineers of perfection, but they had no blueprint for chaos. They tried everything. Massive labor gangs were deployed, not to build new baths or impressive dockyards,
but to desperately deepen existing wells, carving deeper and deeper into the retreating water table. Their perfect fired bricks, which had resisted every element, were now used to line emergency cisterns, hoping to catch and hoard every precious drop of moisture. They meticulously inspected the advanced drainage systems, searching for a clog, a structural flaw, anything mechanical they could fix to reverse the curse. But the system was not flawed. The environment itself had betrayed the contract. The desperation mounted, turning the orderly, predictable streets into marketplaces of fear. The legendary citadel, the high ground where the elite resided, suddenly became a symbol of dangerous privilege.
While the lower city struggled, the possibility arose, whispered first, then shouted, that the reserved water supplies were being managed, perhaps mismanaged, in favor of the rulers. The social contract, held together by generations of prosperity, was tearing at the seams. The final crushing realization was that their architectural triumph was now their prison. Those thick, protective walls that had kept the desert heat out for centuries now hemmed in a starving, dehydrated populace. The city, once a living monument to human capability, was becoming a tomb of brick and geometry. The decision was inevitable, yet impossible. They had to abandon the perfection they had built. The great cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, the marvels of the ancient world, could not survive as static, permanent structures in this dynamic, hostile climate. The orderly existence was over. The exodus began, not as a planned migration, but as a flight of refugees, carrying only what they could, heading east and south, chasing the phantom rivers and the promise of a monsoon that still remembered their names. This was the moment the greatest civilization of its era stopped building and started running. The massive walls were still standing, defiant, but inside, the soul of the Indus was already gone, scattered to the winds. The fragile beauty of their civilization was about to give way to the ultimate, savage reality. Survival at any cost, in a world that no longer recognized their perfect designs. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, stomach-churning dread that settled deep into the perfectly engineered grid of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Their greatest triumph, the masterful hydraulic network that promised eternal, clean water, was now exposed as their ultimate vulnerability. The rivers, once the benevolent arteries of their world, were drying, shifting their colossal, muddy bodies away from the very banks they had nourished for centuries, leaving behind cracked, sun-baked earth that looked like the skin of an ancient, dying giant. The water table, the silent, invisible reservoir that had cushioned their entire existence, was plummeting like a stone thrown into a deep well, mocking their advanced engineering with a geological indifference no human mind could fight. The Great Bath, that monumental centerpiece of purity and ritual, suddenly became a cruel symbol of scarcity, its steps leading down not to refreshing cool water, but to shimmering, foul-smelling silt, baked hard by the relentless sun. People who had taken reliable water for granted, who had never known the hardship of fetching a single jar from miles away, were now staring into the void of empty cisterns.
This wasn't just thirst, it was a profound societal betrayal. Their entire theology, their rituals, their daily rhythm had been built around the abundance of water, and now the source itself was poisoned or gone. The sophisticated drainage channels, once the envy of the known world, designed to whisk waste silently away from the immaculate homes and into the river, started to choke and clog, backing up into the meticulously tiled streets.
This wasn't just a physical crisis. It was a crisis of faith in the rigid, ordered system they had painstakingly constructed. Their priests, their planners, their very belief in the predictable harmony of the cosmos was shattering under the relentless, brassy hammer of the desert sun. When perfect order begins to fracture, chaos doesn't just seep in, it explodes, tearing the social fabric apart, stitch by stitch. The standardized weights and measures, those flawless cubes of chert and agate, the very symbol of their absolute trust in commerce, suddenly meant nothing when there was no grain left to weigh, no transaction left to trust. The central authority, the unseen hand that had coordinated the entire civilization, ensuring every brick was identical, every street was straight, every city was a mirror image of the last, began to loosen its grip. We see the horrifying evidence of this collapse, etched into the very stones of the dying cities themselves.
The sacred 4-to-1 brick ratio, the bedrock of their architectural genius, the symbol of their unwavering adherence to precision and quality control, began to vanish from new constructions, a chilling sign of desperation.
Desperate builders, scrambling for quick repairs and haphazard additions, started using substandard materials, irregularly fired clay, and mismatched stones salvaged from crumbling neighbors. Look closely at the late layers of Mohenjo-Daro, and you see the horrifying truth etched into the geology of the city. The thick, protective walls of the ancients were being replaced by thin, cheap partitions, dividing once grand homes into squalid, desperate tenements. The grand, open avenues, once capable of holding massive public processions and commerce, began to be encroached upon by squat, illegal, jury-rigged structures. The desperate shanty towns of a once proud metropolis turning inward on itself, cannibalizing its own magnificence. Their expansive trading network, the lifeline that stretched from Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, offering them exotic timbers, precious metals, and the blue fire of lapis lazuli, withered into nothingness. Who trades luxuries when simple survival demands every waking moment?
The foreign envoys stopped arriving. The massive dockyards at Lothal fell silent, no longer echoing with the hurried footsteps of long-distance merchants. Only the howl of the hot, dry wind. The majestic seal scripts, those hundreds of enigmatic, beautiful glyphs usually used to stamp goods for international markets and signify ownership,
were now used primarily for desperate local pleas, or perhaps not at all, as literacy itself became a pointless luxury. The world was shrinking, closing in around them, trapping the perfect civilization within walls that were suddenly too thin to offer protection. The legendary stoicism of the Indus people, their famed peaceful nature hinted at by the shocking lack of major weapon caches, was being tested to its absolute breaking point by the twin horrors of thirst and famine. The pressure inside these cities was becoming unbearable, a terrifying compression chamber fueled by resource scarcity. The grand granaries that had stood sentinel, promising food security for generations, were emptying faster than anyone dared to track, forcing officials to ration their last stores of barley and wheat. You can almost hear the low, guttural murmur of the decision being made in the shadowed, thick-walled homes. We cannot stay. The perfectly planned city was becoming a magnificent tomb, beautiful in its geometry, but utterly devoid of life-giving resources. The unthinkable had become the only option, a desperate gamble against the unforgiving terrain. The great exodus was beginning, a silent, desperate scramble, not toward conquest, but toward the uncertain, savage promise of the East and South, away from the dry bones of their failed empire. They were abandoning their perfected world, leaving the perfect designs to be swallowed by the shifting sands, running toward the possibility of life, no matter how chaotic or crude, because their perfection had ultimately sealed their fate. The silence that fell over the great bath was not peaceful. It was the chilling, echoing death knell of a civilization that had believed itself exempt from nature's laws. For centuries, this massive, tank-like structure in Mohenjo-Daro had symbolized their mastery over water, a sacred, geometrically precise monument fed by engineering brilliance. Now, the meticulously laid bitumen lining, meant to waterproof the structure against any siege of time, lay cracked and baking under a sun that felt personally offended by their hubris. The water level dropped relentlessly, not in a flood, but in an insidious, slow evaporation, day after horrifying day, demonstrating that even the greatest reservoirs are merely temporary prisons for water when the sky itself turns its back. The sophisticated sewage system, the ultimate symbol of their order and health, the actual envy of the ancient world, was suddenly turning against them, a viper coiled in the dark earth beneath their grid-planned streets. It was a masterpiece of gravity-fed engineering, designed for constant flow, for the perpetual cleansing of the city's underbelly, requiring a steady influx to maintain its function. But when the powerful Indus River, their eternal benefactor, began to choke and retreat, pulling back its life-giving force, the pressure necessary to flush those precise terracotta pipes vanished completely. That essential flow was replaced by a suffocating, putrid stillness, trapping the accumulated waste of generations within the clay arteries of the city. The sewage lines, once conduits of immaculate health and cleanliness, became dark, subterranean vectors of swift, unforgiving disease, breeding pestilence right beneath the feet of the perfect urban plan. Imagine the terror of realizing that the very architecture designed to save you was now actively working to kill you. A betrayal etched in baked brick and clay. The thick walls, those wonderful thermal masses that had perfectly regulated the climate, keeping the interiors cool during the peak heat, now became monumental ovens. With the air humidity plummeting and the searing, dry winds blowing relentlessly from the abandoned plains, the heat absorbed during the day could no longer dissipate effectively at night. The cool desert evenings, the very balance point of their climate control system, became a cruel joke, replaced by oppressive, stale, dry heat that cooked the internal environment of the houses, trapping the misery and the rising stench inside the sealed perfection. The people who prided themselves on never having to deal with the messy chaos of nature were now subject to its most brutal, inescapable physics. The massive fortified granaries, designed to feed tens of thousands during normal times and hold vast reserves during lean times, were the next catastrophic domino to fall. Not because the harvest failed instantly, but because the meticulously planned mechanism of centralized distribution shattered under the weight of fear. These urbanites operated on an absolute trust in order, relying on a central authority, perhaps priests, maybe powerful merchant guilds, whose faces and names we may never fully know, but whose control over logistics and resource allocation was absolute. When the sheer, gnawing desperation of existential threat finally hit the streets, that absolute control, that delicate balance of societal trust, dissolved in a terrifying instant into pure, raw, individual chaos. The standardized weights and measures, those perfect little cubes of chert and agate that defined their fair commerce for centuries, were tossed aside in favor of brute strength and savage hoarding. The social contract, the unseen bond that held the geometric perfection together, disintegrated faster than the thick walls could crumble. This wasn't a failure of structure. It was a failure of the human spirit, when pushed past its belief in order. The shifting sands were not just a poetic metaphor for change. They were the executioner's dust, driven by meteorological forces far beyond the understanding of even the most brilliant Harappan mind. Geologists now whisper the terrible truth. The monsoons, the very breath of life for the entire Indian subcontinent, began to track sharply eastward, systematically abandoning the western plains where the great cities lay anchored. This wasn't merely a temporary drought that required clever water management. It was a fundamental, permanent betrayal of the hydrological cycle, transforming the once fertile floodplains of the Indus into a screaming, hot, and unforgiving desert within the span of a single, agonizing generation. Imagine the horror of the Harappan engineer, the man who had laid the bricks and calibrated the precise slope of the drain pipes to ensure a 1 in a 100-year flood could be managed, watching his flawless, rational creation turn utterly lethal because of an unexpected,
continental climate shift.
Their entire belief system, whatever its form, and it must have been predicated on the sacred geometry of the city plan and the absolute power of order, imploded. When that sacred order failed, the psychological impact must have been total, suggesting that even the gods themselves had grown weary of their demanding, flawless perfection. They had meticulously built a sophisticated machine that worked perfectly only under perfect, stable conditions. And when the conditions shifted even slightly, when the world became messy, the machine could only shatter and metastasize into a death trap. This profound realization is why the abandonment was so swift, so clean, leaving behind almost no signs of violent struggle or protracted warfare within the city walls themselves. There were no mass graves suggesting a final bloody siege, only the eerie, preserved stillness of streets suddenly and completely emptied. They didn't stay to fight over the last foul drops of water in the dead wells. They simply packed up the bare necessities, a few valuable seals perhaps, some jewelry, and the haunting, inescapable memory of the grid, and walked, seeking the unpredictable, chaotic possibility of life. They walked toward the east, toward the messy, unpredictable regions where the rainfall still dared to fall, choosing the wild, untamed wilderness over the geometric death trap their own perfection had created. The ultimate, crushing irony of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa was that their technological triumph, their unparalleled cleanliness and rigid structure, demanded a level of environmental stability that Earth itself refused to guarantee, sealing their ultimate doom not with a dramatic, cataclysmic bang, but with the slow, agonizing sound of drying clay. The clay was drying, yes, but what the people of Mohenjo-Daro heard was far worse than the whisper of dust. They heard the sound of the Great Bath, their sacred communal centerpiece, draining faster than the supply could replenish it. For centuries, this massive tank-like structure, lined with baked brick and sealed with natural bitumen, a technological marvel rivaling the Romans millennia later, had been the beating heart of their spiritual and hygienic world, a symbol of their mastery over nature. Now its level dropped noticeably each season, forcing the priests to ration the purifying water, a concept utterly foreign to a civilization built on the bedrock of abundance. Panic didn't erupt in riots, for the Harappans were too disciplined for that. But it settled in the gut like the desert sand they were beginning to swallow, an insidious fear creeping into the perfect grid of their minds. The meticulous planned drainage system, the envy of the ancient world, began to betray them, turning their greatest achievement into a silent threat. These underground arteries, wide enough for a man to walk through and covered with precisely cut stone slabs, required a constant, steady flow of water to flush the waste away from the city centers and into the designated outflow areas beyond the formidable walls. As the flow of the feeder canals dwindled, turning from powerful streams into muddy, pathetic trickles, the accumulated refuse began to back up, creating stagnant, toxic pools deep within the flawless brickwork, far from sight, but terrifyingly close. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was the silent introduction of lethal bacteria and waterborne disease into a population that had enjoyed perhaps the highest level of public health known in all of antiquity. A horrifying reversal of fortune.
The thick walls, those architectural safeguards that were once their shield against the scorching heat and the raw elements, now became dangerous incubators, trapping the rising stench and the invisible killers that multiplied in the fetid water pooling beneath the city streets, mocking their 1,000 years of architectural genius and sophisticated city planning. The true calamity, the slow-motion geological disaster that no city planner or high priest could ever possibly foresee, was the profound, fundamental shifting of the river systems themselves, the literal betrayal of the life source. For too long, the Indus civilization relied heavily not just on the mighty, obvious Indus River, but on the vast, powerful Ghaggar-Hakra system, what many scholars believe was the ancient, mythic Saraswati, a river celebrated in their earliest oral traditions as the eternal supplier of unstoppable life.
Geological analysis now reveals the terrifying truth, excavated from the dry beds of forgotten rivers. A major tectonic event far upstream in the Himalayan foothills likely caused the crucial Yamuna River, a vital tributary, to literally change its mind, abandoning the Ghaggar-Hakra course entirely and diverting ruthlessly eastward, flowing instead into the distant Ganges system. This colossal, unprecedented act of natural betrayal, a river committing hydraulic suicide, starved the eastern cities, sites like Kalibangan and Banawali, of their primary, irreplaceable lifeblood, leaving vast, intricate networks of irrigation canals immediately dry, their mud brick banks cracking and curling under a sun that grew noticeably more vengeful every single year. The vast, majestic urban centers, those monumental hubs of global trade that linked sophisticated Mesopotamia to the lucrative ports of the Arabian Sea, started hemorrhaging their massive populations in an agonizing, drawn-out process. This was not the sudden, dramatic evacuation Hollywood loves to imagine, but a creeping, heartbreaking diaspora. Families abandoning their perfectly square homes and their beloved, standardized ceramic vessels, seeking the elusive, increasingly desperate promise of water elsewhere, further south, further east.
They moved deliberately toward smaller, more manageable satellite villages, desperately trying to maintain the Harappan way of life, the standardized weights and measures, the geometric brick sizes, the familiar seals of the administrators, in places where the very soil was turning hostile, saline, and utterly unforgiving. The once unified, incredibly efficient trade network, which relied absolutely on the stability and massive scale of the major port cities like Lothal, began to fragment instantly, breaking down into isolated, self-sustaining pockets. Imagine the historical horror. The people who invented the concept of standardized measurement now found the very standard of survival, the availability of clean water, was suddenly irrevocably gone. And then came the final, devastating insult. The monsoon, the very breath of the subcontinent,
began to fail with frightening, unnerving regularity. Scientific data pulled from ancient sediment layers and meticulously analyzed pollen samples paints a brutal picture of a prolonged, centuries-long dry phase, a relentless aridification that pressed down upon the subcontinent like a physical, suffocating weight, an unrelenting drought. The sophisticated grid farming techniques, which ingeniously utilized the predictable seasonal flooding of the riverbanks to ensure 2 reliable harvests every year, suddenly became unreliable, then disastrous, then utterly impossible to execute. The colossal granaries of Harappa, those monumental structures built high and solid to secure their future against any natural adversity, began to empty faster than they could possibly be refilled, turning the promise of long-term stability into the bitter, immediate reality of famine and relentless internal migration. The great civilization, once defined by its unbelievable peace and pervasive order, was now defined solely by scarcity, inching closer to the fatal brink, betrayed utterly by the very climate they thought their perfect walls could conquer. The silence in the increasingly abandoned cities was deafening. The only remaining sound, the slow, abrasive grind of the desert, reclaiming the perfect geometry of the once mighty Indus, erasing a millennium of perfection with fine sand. The silence that settled upon the grid-planned perfection of Mohenjo-Daro was not the quiet of night, but the deep, existential stillness of a civilization realizing its own magnificent failure. We have seen the empty streets, but we must now look deeper into the arteries of their astonishing engineering, because the very lifeline they engineered so flawlessly, water, was about to become the agent of their doom. The monumental arrogance of perfection lies not in what you achieve, but what you assume you can control. They built the world's first urban sanitation system, an underground lattice of drains and inspection holes, a miracle of terracotta and engineering unmatched for millennia, promising cleanliness and infinite abundance. Yet their engineers, who could measure the angle of a house wall to the 1,000th degree, could not command the clouds. The monsoon, the colossal breathing heart of the subcontinent, was changing its rhythm, stuttering, coughing, dying. This was not a quick drought that a sophisticated society could weather. This was a geological betrayal, a deep, slow tectonic groan beneath the surface of the world that spanned centuries. The massive Gagar-Hakra river system, once thought to be the mythical Saraswati itself, a vein of life that supported hundreds of settlements, began to starve, its waters captured and diverted by slow continental uplifts, rerouted eastward toward the distant, burgeoning Ganga basin. For generations, the water levels dropped imperceptibly, just enough to make the massive, uniform fields of wheat and barley gasp for life. Now, consider the sheer scale of the Indus project. Entire cities built not of temporary mud brick, but of fired brick, millions upon millions of them, baked hard to withstand the searing heat and monsoon humidity. Each standardized brick required fire, and fire required fuel. This demand for timber
relentless, staggering, and required for the maintenance of their colossal infrastructure, gnawed at the surrounding forests for over 1,000 years. The thick-walled homes, designed to keep the inhabitants cool and protected, became a secondary, silent vector of their collapse. They cleared the wood to fire the bricks, accelerating the very desertification they were trying to shield themselves from. The protective green buffer zone vanished, replaced by arid scrubland that offered no shade, retained no moisture, and provided no defense against the searing, abrasive winds.
The heat, once perfectly managed by their ingenious architecture and sophisticated airflow systems, began to win the war by attacking the supply chain itself. The environmental ledger, which had balanced so perfectly for centuries under the cloak of abundance, plunged violently into the red, signaling a resource bankruptcy from which there was no recovery. The fields, already starved of the retreating river water, now faced exposed topsoil carried away by devastating dust storms that were once mitigated by the lost tree canopy.
Harvests didn't just shrink, they became unpredictable, terrifying gambles against the malice of nature. The famed standardization that ensured every citizen received the same measured grain, a hallmark of their egalitarian prosperity, now meant that failure was standardized too. When the centralized system failed in one place, it failed everywhere, simultaneously, leaving no local pocket of resilience to lean upon.
There was no glorious final mass battle, no enemy army scaling the thick walls. The enemy was invisible. Climate volatility, resource exhaustion, and the profound slow-motion failure of the hydrological cycle. The great empty granaries of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa stood as terrifying monuments not to foreign invasion or sudden famine, but to sheer, unmanageable logistical failure. They simply could not bring the crops in anymore. The citizens, perhaps the most organized people the ancient world had ever known, did the only thing rational humans could do. They walked. They didn't flee a conqueror. They fled a lack of viable soil and a lack of reliable water. The massive urban centers fractured and disintegrated into smaller, less complex, more sustainable villages further southeast, clinging desperately to the shifting remnants of the monsoon belt.
They traded their legendary perfect grid planning for decentralized survival, their sophisticated drainage systems for simple, hand-dug wells that offered only temporary respite. This was not an abandonment spurred by panic, but an orderly, pragmatic retreat from unsustainable monumentality, a necessary shedding of urban complexity to preserve the core of life. The weight of their own magnificent civilization was too much to bear in the face of a changing planet. They were trading in the high-tech wonders of urban life, the public baths, the precise, standardized weights, the intricate unicorn seals, for the brutal necessities of survival farming, a painful devolution back to simpler times. The incredible administrative capacity that built the cities was now used only for organizing their own dispersion. As the last few families gathered their essential bronze tools and walked away from the silent, wide avenues, the desert offered its final, chilling insult. The deep protective city walls, once tireless guardians against the sun, began to act as massive, inescapable solar ovens, trapping the heat inside the empty chambers.
The perfect geometry that had defined 1,000 years of peace became a perfect arid cage, slowly baking the remnants of the civilization into archaeological dust, erasing their indelible mark from the earth. The grind continued, abrasive and unstoppable, defining the end of the most advanced civilization the world would not see again for another 2,000 years.